5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Go, I'm going to start.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Jake Matthews, the online editor of HR Grapevine, and today's webinar will cover everything you need to know about HMRC's much debated and much argued IR35 changes. Throughout the webinar, I'll be monitoring the questions, so send them throughout, and at the end of the webinar, we'll put them to the panelists. Joining me today is David Hanna, Experis' Operations Director, and Dougal McIntosh, Experis' Permanent Solutions Director. Over to you, Dougal.
Jake, thank you very much, and thank you very much everybody that's dialed in. Thanks for joining us on a Friday lunchtime to talk about tax. So I'm just going to introduce myself, and then I'm going to hand over to my colleague Dave Hanna, who's going to set the agenda and open our session. I work for Experis. I've been with the company since 2006. I've done many different roles, predominantly leading our big managed service programs, both contingent and perm. I also set up the engineering vertical for Experis, and I'm currently responsible for all of Experis' permanent recruitment. Just to put that into context, we'll place about 4,000 people into professional perm roles on any given year. Dave, perhaps you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, good afternoon everybody. My name is David Hanna and I'm the Operations Efficiency Director for Experis in the UK. It's a title that covers a multitude of sins, but very specifically for the purposes of today, one of the areas I'm responsible for is coordinating our response to legislative changes like the IR35 stuff we're talking about today. As a result, luckily, I spent the last year or so focusing on shaping and influencing and really just understanding and ultimately deploying these changes, not only into our organisation, but obviously also working very closely with clients to make sure that they're properly set to implement in their operations as well. Before we go into the detail of the day, probably just a quick word to talk about our organisation for those of you who don't yet work with us. Experis are a global leader in professional talent sourcing and workforce solution planning. We won't go into all the details you can see on the screen there. You'll be having these slides to review at your leisure later. Suffice to say, we provide a full spectrum talent acquisition service. As you can see there, the key UK services spans everything from professional resourcing through to RPO managed service solutions and outcome-based project solutions across our three main professional verticals, which is IT, finance and engineering. The clients you can see listed on the right-hand side there are just a subset of our full client base, which covers 80% of the Fortune 500 companies globally. And we've selected those today because they represent areas where we've done large-scale permanent hiring programs, which Dougal is going to cover off in a bit more detail later on in the presentation. So on to today's planned structure. Firstly, I'm going to take you through a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the impending IR35 changes and our view really on the major short-term risks attached to those for your organisations. As a caveat up front, what today won't be is a very granular level review of IR35 and the contractual nuances and implications of IR35, simply because our assumption for this session today is that probably by now most of your organisations are some way through the detail of that and working on deploying your own specific challenges and plans against that. What I will say though is if you're not in that position and you still do have questions and you need assistance about how to get through from today until April the 6th, then by all means you'll have our details at the end of this call. Do give us a call and we can help you make sure that your organisation is properly set for those challenges. Today is going to be more about thinking about the future, what those challenges and what the changes mean for not only today but moving forward. Dougal is then going to have a look at setting this very specific piece of legislation really within the context of the social, political and global economic factors that are shaping talent acquisition today and which are likely to accelerate for you in the future. And he'll then go on to highlight the opportunity these changes represent for you to alter and enhance your workforce blend and give you some concrete examples of where we've helped to deliver that type of business change to date. And then hopefully, if that doesn't take too long, we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So, firstly, IR35. I'm sure you have all heard about it. It's front and centre of the industry's mind at the moment. And it refers really to a very specific piece of legislative change that's coming into effect on the 6th of April this year. and it affects any individual using a personal services company or PSC, which are commonly referred to as limited companies, and delivering those services into a public sector body as the ultimate end client. So that's quite important, those two pieces of information, PSC into a public sector body. The first point to note is that really it isn't new legislation. So IR35 as a legislation has been around since 2000, but rather it's more of a change in the application of the rules, and it's changing the responsibility for who actually decides whether the rules apply, which today sits with the owner of the personal services company, and it's moving that responsibility over to either an end client or agency, what's deemed as the fee payer. So really, people like ourselves and also yourselves as well, potentially, if you're employing a personal services company directly. Now, although the principle's clear, what's caused a lot of problems for the industry and for people in general really is that there's a lack of clarity in certain key areas of the legislation. So, for example, during the consultation process, at the start of the process, the decision about making a decision on who was going to decide whether a role was in or out of scope was originally going to sit with the fee payer, and fairly late on in the consultation process, that decision switched over to the end client, and that caused a fair bit of consternation and obviously had implications for communication and for finding resources within those organisations to make those decisions. So that's one of the things that we are working through at the moment. So who's affected is a key thing here really. Obviously any PSC who's being provided or providing services either directly or through an agency to a public sector body is in scope for review. Not all will be deemed in scope because the individual working practices really becomes the key determinant for whether or not people are deemed as disguised employees or not. HMRC has finally delivered a digital tool which is called the Employment Status Service, or ESS, which you may come across, which is really designed to help any party, so the worker themselves, the agency or the client, make a decision on whether roles are in or out of scope. And our analysis and the first few live decisions, which we're already starting to see come into us now, suggests that actually it's probably less onerous than we thought it was. But certainly we are seeing more decisions coming through that are suggesting workers are out of scope based on their day-to-day working practices than we originally expected to see. And far less understood is the fact that the private sector companies providing PSCs as part of their services to end public sector bodies are also potentially in scope. It's a very important point. So it's not just referring to people who work directly into the public sector. Those types of companies need to work with the public sector to understand whether those contracts that they are actually supplying their services through are deemed under the legislation as outsourced contracts, thus taking those PSCs out of scope. And if they're not outsourced contracts, then effectively the PSCs they're delivering, although they're nominally working for a private sector organisation, are still as in scope for review as if they were working directly for the public sector. And that decision on the outsourcing status hinges very much on a couple of things really. And again, they're not particularly clear in the legislation. It's causing a lot of effort and time for people to try and understand where they stand. So the two things they really look at are how are the services being provided to the end client. So for example, if the workers are on site providing their services to the private sector organisation, then they should be out of scope. If they're actually on site providing their service directly into an end client, then it's less clear. And equally, the way that the costing is done for the services. So if it's just a pass-through operation with time and materials cost with margin applied, and that is being passed straight to the client, it's probably far more likely that that type of individual will be deemed in scope than one who is wrapped up as part of a larger outcome or deliverables-based pricing model. So those are some of the areas we're spending a lot of time working with, particularly with private sector companies at the moment. With those fundamental areas still to be finally locked down, as well as fee payers working through the practical aspects of how they will process in-scope workers after the 6th of April, there's clearly a fair bit of work still to be done over the next few weeks. When we talk about future changes, I think one thing we can be pretty certain of at the moment is there aren't going to be any changes at the last minute to this. It is going to happen. It's planned legislation, and it will be coming in from the 6th of April. And we really now, I think, as an industry, just need to focus on getting through, delivering the change for the incumbent population, altering our sourcing processes so we're providing compliant candidates for future roles, and then really working very closely with government and with industry and with clients just to make sure that we are set if, which is a potential if, this legislation does in fact get rolled out to the private sector at a later date, which certainly is an implication of what's being done. We don't have any clear steer on that yet, but it could well happen in short order. And the other thing, really, I think I'll put it here as future changes to IR35. There's also a future thing to remember, really, that IR35 is only really one piece of legislation which is actually targeted in a much broader fashion at this type of working in general. So I think anybody who's listened to budgets or autumn statements recently will see that very clearly government has a desire to target people in this space, flexible working and contracting from a tax perspective, to make sure it's closing the gap as much as possible between full employment and what they see as a more flexible and tax avoiding route that is currently in use. So we fully expect, it may not be called IR35, but we fully expect over time a number of other pieces of legislation and focus on this area again, which is why we're very keen to talk to you about what you can do in the permanent space to avoid those types of challenges moving forward. So very quickly then, some of the impacts as we are seeing them at the moment. We will produce or share with you after this a briefing document we've provided which goes into these in a bit more detail. But I think some of the key things really to look at: continuity of service. You're potentially already seeing this in your organisations today. The major factor here is obviously uncertainty within the worker population. Because we're not 100% clear on the final guidelines or how they're being applied, there are a number of workers who are unsure, many of them voting with their feet. Obviously it's an uneven playing field at the moment, so you do have the ability as a worker to take your services out of the public sector and into the private sector, and we are starting to see that within organisations today, which is obviously causing uncertainty and change within the population. The flip side of that as well, as you can imagine, is it makes the public sector or private sector companies working in that space less attractive for new resources coming into the business. And we're already again seeing pressure on niche skills in those organisations. The ability to attract people into the sector is hardening, and we have to work ever harder really to get compliant resources in those niche skills into effective companies. Now, both of those elements obviously lead to cost pressures as clients react to those shortages or need to retain critical resources by raising pay rates. And again, we're in those conversations with our clients today. At present, really, those pressures are fairly pent up, only because we haven't seen a huge deluge yet of decisions coming through about status. They will start to happen now very quickly. I think we're starting to see the first of those through the digital tool and other decisions, and we expect to see an increase in request and negotiation on pay rates as those formal decisions start to put through. I've called out communication as a separate point here, just to really make the point that it's very important in terms of mitigating some of those other challenges I've already mentioned. So sadly, because there's no clear guidance in some of the key areas, we've had to produce and work with our clients to produce a number of holding messages over the previous months, really to try and pass as much information as we can on to the workers, and also keep everybody up to date with any changes as they happened. That uncertainty, I think, is going to remain a factor in attraction and acquisition of talent in this space for quite a while to come. And I'd encourage all of you really to work very closely with your suppliers and clients and others just to make sure you're generating as comprehensive and as clear a communication plan as you can, because I think if you can do that, it does go some way towards mitigating some of those issues around continuity and attraction. And finally, we come on to the strategic aspect of these, which I think Dougal's going to go into a lot more detail on shortly. And that really is how best you absorb the lessons of IR35 and start to think about some of those other external pressures that are out in the marketplace to set yourselves up and build your workforce for the future, so that IR35, but more importantly other changes and legislative changes coming down the track, don't have as big an impact next time round for you. So I think at that point I'll hand over to Dougal, who's hopefully going to take you through a few more of the challenges for the future.
Dave, thank you very much for setting the scene for me. So changes to who's responsible for tax collection could drive a coach and horses through your business strategy. The skills exit and costs inflate, and I don't think anybody really knows the impact yet, but you can bet that it's going to be the market that will decide. And I'm going to be discussing how you de-risk this by replacing contractors with permanent employees. In the markets that Experis operate in, the projects that we work with look like digital transformation, so that's moving from bricks and mortar to digital platforms, using technology to automate processes and AI to improve customer experience. Clearly, these are big priorities with big prizes for organisations if they can get them right. whether they're in the public or the private sector. The problem is that everybody is competing for the skills that they need to deliver them. So it's the candidate who decides where they go. In a recent white paper that we put together called The Skills Revolution, our CEO, Jonas Priesling, said that those with the right skills will increasingly call the shots, create opportunities and choose how, where and when they work. And for organisations that are trying to access these skills, that's going to be more important than accessing capital if they're to compete and grow. In Manpower Group, we've been talking about this for a decade under the banner Human Age, where we see 4 macroeconomic forces coming together. So the first is shifting demographics. So this is where either people follow the work or work follows people. Greater individual choice. I've already talked about this. There's people with in-demand skills. They get to choose where and who they work for. Client sophistication. So this is customers demanding increasingly niche skills. It's not good enough any longer just to be a mechanical engineer, for example. You also expect them to have sector and application knowledge. And finally, technology. There's lots of examples, whether it's automation or AI, but we see the result of this with the likes of Uber, who are the world's largest taxi company, but own no taxis. Scarily, I heard on Radio 4 the other day that these technology companies call their drivers meat puppets. This means that eventually they expect them to be replaced by automation. Either way, this is going to revolutionise the skills agenda. And governments all over the world are trying to figure out how they respond to these forces, whether it's restrictions on immigration, regulations for taxi companies, or in this case, how self-employment impacts how much tax money they get. My argument is that the change to IR35 is just a symptom of these changes. And whilst we might be able to figure out a way to move the issue in the short term, you could also look at this as an opportunity to rebalance your workforce towards permanent employment. It's worth pointing out that I am deliberately not referring to the so-called gig economy. In my view, the whilst this has exploded in the last few years, I think this morning I heard it's up to 4% of workers in this country, it's still largely made up of low-paid, low-skilled workers. We know that Uber still finds it very difficult to set up in areas where there is high employment. Our research suggests that skilled workers still want secure, well-paid, rewarding, long-term work. Clearly, if you can get this while also working as a highly paid contractor, why wouldn't you? IR35 could be the catalyst, which means contracting makes less sense for both individuals and employers. So the opportunity. Can IR35 be the burning platform you need to sell the business case to change how you bring talent into your organisation? Well, first off, there's a clear cost benefit. On average, a professional IT contractor in our market is 30% more expensive than their perm equivalent. Contractors will rightly argue that they're giving you flexibility, expert skills and pay for their training. In reality, the UK has a very flexible employment legislation. Experis alone have over 6,000 interims on assignment with our clients, and we know through our analytics that a large percentage of these will be on assignments for many years, often being trained by their customers. Risk. Obviously, the significant risk. It can be largely mitigated if you're using a well-managed program. However, we expect HR teams will increasingly need to be aware of the risk to organisations, whether it's reputational, things like 0 hours contracts, financial, things like the tax burden. That's before you even get into liabilities. But I think one of the biggest risks to organisations is IP. So my argument is bringing in perm workers, it will improve your in-house capability. The so-called war for talent has meant that people have increasingly gone to the contractor market as they found it too hard to find permanent people. So keys are core to your business, however, this is just a short-term fix. You won't own anything your competitors can't buy, and if you're in a knowledge-based organisation, you'll quickly lose your differentiation. We believe that you can bring these skills in-house if you're more creative in your approach. We've got lots of new talent attraction tools out there in the market, and there's a proliferation of training platforms and an awareness of how you can bridge skills gaps. This has created opportunities, which means it's now easier to access, retain and develop talent within your own businesses. So a quick reminder, we are separating our message from the growing gig economy, which is exploding, where technology and low-paid workers come together. And whilst we hear about software developers coding from the beach, we do believe that big organisations and workers will still want secure, long-term skilled workers that they can invest in. Recent research conducted by the Manpower Group highlights a significant increase in the permanent workforce within the IT sector, up by 22% for some skills. What I'm trying to articulate here are the micro forces which should help create a case for change and finding a way to do what might have been put in the too difficult tray. So tax changes, tenure restrictions, cost, and maybe even skills flight, all driving the business case to use contractors down. Technology, which means everybody is visible, government help with training, new training platforms, the massive cost benefit, all driving the case to permanently employ workers up. Okay, so I'm going to make 3 key points here. Number one, obviously different companies will have different approaches. We released a white paper last year which talked about HR and talent leadership needed to start seeing this as a science. We talked about how organisations needed to shift their mindset from consumers of work to builders of talent. Pure transactional relationships will build neither trust nor brand loyalty, as workers see there is no job for life. Yet no, they have long working lives ahead, and employers will need to do things fundamentally differently to attract, retain and engage people for varied careers over the long term, even if they are not the employer for life. In 2006, Deloitte released a millennial survey which reinforces this. Millennials often put personal values ahead of organisational goals, and several have shunned employers that conflict with their beliefs. Social media means that we can all see the new candidate. Our challenge is engaging with them in a compelling way, which means they join you and not your competition. My final point is on what we call learnability. Skills cycles are shorter. 65% of jobs Generation Z will perform do not even exist yet. The need for robust talent pipelines with relevant skills and appetite for continuous learning will be greater than ever. The focus will be on developing resilient careers versus just jobs. This means you need to be recruiting people who can continue to learn new skills. Okay, now I want to talk about how we attract those people into your businesses. I've touched on this already, but many of our customers talk about their demographic cliff. This is where a large percentage of their workforce are due to retire over the next 10, 15 years. Many of these workers hold the keys to their organisation's IP. The Coalition for the Digital Economy identified the tech industry, which accounts for more domestic output than manufacturing and construction, is at risk of a shortfall of skills in the tune of 800,000 jobs by 2020. This needs to think about how you attract and retain the next generation of workers. By 2020, millennials should form 50% of the global workforce. Millennials prioritise 3 things when choosing where and how they work: money, security, and time off. They want to be rewarded for their effort, feel secure in their employment, and they also value working with great people and enjoying the time they spend in their jobs, together with the opportunity to work flexibly and develop new skills. Point 2, my background is engineering. Only 9% of engineers in the UK are women. In IT it's a bit better, at 17%, but compared to our international competition, we're well behind. For example, in Eastern Europe and China, women make up over 30% of the workers in these sectors. This is no longer on the agenda because it's the right thing to do, but critical if we're going to bridge the skills gap. My final point, the average tenure of employees is reducing. It's now about 4 years. So you need a robust retention strategy in place to ensure that you get the most out of your existing talent and have a pipeline of people who are keen to join your organisation. You've got lots of new tools that you can use to help engage these workers and reduce barriers to entry. But one of the techniques that we've found works particularly well is an alumni program. This is where you keep in touch with employees as they go out of your business and gain more experience. We call these boomerang workers. And they're an underdeveloped talent pool with unique qualifications that can really help employers address their talent shortages. So now I'm going to talk about a couple of case studies, and we've got one from the public sector and one from the private sector. The first one I'm going to talk about is a public sector client of ours. Okay, so this is a media and telecommunications company in the private sector. They had a skills gap within their digital team and needed to hire over 20 Python developers. For a number of reasons, they didn't want to add to their own headcount, but wanted the security and cost benefit of using permanent employees. The average rate for a contractor Python developer is over £450 per day, versus about $55,000 for their perm equivalent. Within Experis, we have a model we call employed consultants. This is where we permanently employ the workers and then assign them onto our clients' projects. We work with them on a model where we jointly recruit mid-career candidates, assess them against core competencies, including technical testing, aptitude and cultural fit, but crucially, their ability to learn. We know the learning path for IT skills, so we work with our training partners to develop a tailored training program. Experis employ, HR manage and train these workers. However, they are working on the client side. They help us to understand their performance, which allow us to bridge skills gaps with training. Each EC have their own career management dashboard, which our training manager can monitor. We can exit poor performers and accelerate the development of high performers. At the end of the program, the client will either hire the worker directly themselves, or we can move what is now a very valuable resource onto a new project. We're planning to roll this out now across two other technology areas, Scala and cybersecurity. Both, if you're in the IT space, are obviously very high demand skills in the marketplace. The next case study is a public sector client of ours. I won't name them, but they are a ministerial department, and those of you that are paying attention will probably guess who they are in a moment. Last year, they moved forward with a major IT transformation project. You might recognise their challenge in your own world. They were working in silos with lots of IT service providers and contractors just to keep the lights on. The plan was to bring together their technology department with their digital team to create a single IT team who would move all of their customer-facing services online and deliver a single platform which was shared across all their services. The objective, improving the customer experience, and crucially for the department and us as taxpayers, saving millions. The logic was to do this in-house rather than outsource, and I think this echoes with my message today. They took the decision that doing this in-house rather than paying a service provider was less risky, saved them money, and that this transformation needed to be a core competence for them going forward. They wanted to recruit 200 heads in central London. The skills were IT and digital, service operators, business analysts, project managers, graphic and UX designers, but also very niche skills like biometric architects. We went live with the program in September last year, and we're just about halfway through at the moment. They've also got significant salary challenges. Our market benchmarking shows that they're paying between 10 and 20% below their private sector competitors. We've got a public sector team, and they know the market and the candidate community very well, and they work with the client to help them understand and build a plan to attract the right people. So a value proposition, which included a clear purpose alongside a message that they'll be working on a groundbreaking project that would be the making of their careers. We needed to give them a great candidate experience that made them feel valued and special, and crucially today, fast. And we also needed to think about a teachable fit. We knew that we were not going to be able to get the final technical competence that we needed, and that we need to compromise on technical skills, and understanding how and who we could recruit and train into these roles, and being aligned with the hiring managers right from the beginning was absolutely key. Okay, so now I'm on my last slide. So our message has been that there are lots of forces coming together, which means replacing contractors with permanent workers makes sense if your business relies on knowledge. You'll be able to compete, reduce your business risk, and save money in the longer term. We also know that if you're recruiting specialist skills, there'll be a lot of competition for talent, and you'll need to be well organised, think about your attraction strategy, and be prepared to train and invest in your plan. So our final slide really is our giveaway, and you want to ask yourselves and all your service providers if they're ready. This is a checklist that we think that you need to test yourself against if you're going to move and aggressively replace contractors with permanent employees. So that's my piece done. I'll pass over to Dave, who will bookend our webinar.
Good, thank you, Dougal, and I'm pleased to see that we still have even more people than we started with, given it's tax and permanent discussion on Friday, so I think we've done fairly well. I think you've covered up in great detail there the options around permanent, and I think we are very keen on the research that we've done that a flexible, motivated, well-trained permanent workforce is going to be a key part of the blend of successful organisations as we move forward for all the reasons we've discussed. A few other things from me, I suppose, going back to the start of the presentation about IR35. Again, I won't labour the point, but it is happening. It's happening soon, and hopefully for most of you on the call, you're in a position where you are set and ready to deploy everything you need to do for April the 6th. Two things really. If you're not and you are worried and you still need assistance to understand where you are, particularly around some of those aspects of whether or not in the private sector your workers are even in scope for this, if there is a public sector client in the chain somewhere, then do give us a call. You'll have all our details after this. My details are on there, and I say this is my area of focus, so please give me a call even if you just want to talk through and sanity check your thinking. The other point I suppose I will make, referring back to the services that we provide and also your own blend of workforce today, I'm sure. Dougal's focused a lot today on the permanent workforce because we believe it's going to be vital moving forward. Let's not lose sight of the fact that there will always be a need for good contract resources. Dougal mentioned the employee consultant model, which is growing month on month for us as an area in the workforce where people see the flexibility of using contract type resource, but actually get the benefits of the stability of perm, and also outcome-based statement of work and project-based solutions. So all of those things, I think, moving forward will be an important blend in your workforce. We will be providing information actually about all of those, not just about the perm focus today. So you'll have an opportunity to look at that and reach out. But other than that, I think just to say thank you. We'll be releasing a lot of information after this, the white papers that Dougal mentioned, briefing documents on IR35, and contact details if you need to speak to us. Other than that, I think we're good for questions now. If you could, Jake. Are you there, Jake? You have a bit of dead air time there.
Oh, it's gone.
Right. We'll just leave it for a couple of minutes, hopefully while the facilitators come back online. Maybe they're collating through the large number of questions that we have.
Dave, I've got a question for you. Obviously, we've got a number of contractors that we're deploying to the public sector who are about to be affected in April. Well, what are we seeing in terms of the immediate impact and the disruption there? We're seeing a flight?
Good question. So if we have a bit of time, I think you're right, it's probably useful to expound a little bit on maybe some of the detail on R35. So I would say at the moment, not a flight at all. There's been a delay in getting decisions through, if we're honest, because of waiting for the digital tool. I think a lot of the government departments themselves are a little unsure of their responsibilities, what resources they need to have in place to make decisions, for example, about status. And also they're waiting themselves, I think, in a lot of cases for internal guidance from HMRC and others before they are deemed to be the first person to make a decision. Generally speaking, we've had a lot of conversations. As I mentioned at the start, I think the digital tool has actually come out and produced a lot more out-of-scope decisions than we initially expected. So there's some comfort for the workers around that actually, as long as you are working in the correct manner as a flexible resource and a business on your own account, and substituting and taking financial risk and making sure that you're responsible at your own cost for reworking any substandard work and key triggers like that, I think if those are in place, we are actually seeing that this isn't a huge disruption. I think it's important for everybody to not get caught up in the noise around IR35. As I said, it's really just to refocus on an existing piece of legislation. in theory, this should all be happening today. The owners of those PSCs should be making this assessment today. The criteria that are used haven't changed. Now, obviously, we are expecting to see some impact there. There was a statistic, I think, produced at the outset of this by the government and others, which suggested that only about 10% of PSCs in the public sector were deemed to be applying the regulations correctly. And there was a feeling at the outset that there was going to be a huge impact, as this other 90% were impacted and effectively dragged into, as they would see, a tax trap. I don't think we've seen that at all. Certainly the implications have not been anywhere near that type of magnitude, but at the same time there is disruption. There are people who, primarily because they're unsure of what's going on, are looking to potentially move before they get a final decision. So yes, there is disruption, but I wouldn't say that there's a huge amount of walkout and other things that we've seen so far. And
Dave, I was interested because I was chatting to one of my colleagues earlier on about private sector companies. We provide contractors to private sector companies and then pass them on to the public sector, delivering services. What's the impact there?
That's a good one. I think probably for the certainly the guest list that I saw prior to the webinar beginning, I think that's the important section probably for people on this call to think about. It's worth remembering that the end client is the key thing here, public sector end client, and actually in theory there could be any number of what are called engagers, so any number of companies in that chain. So you may start with a limited company, provided or working through an agency with a company. That company in the private sector may potentially provide that worker onto another private sector company, who in turn may actually be deploying them on a public sector end client opportunity. So in theory, all of those arrangements need to be investigated. Obviously, it gets hard. Getting decisions out of those chain entities is very hard, and that's what's causing us some degree of complexity in how we manage this. But generally speaking, this legislation is designed to capture huge swathes of private sector workers who are legitimately working on outsourced contracts, all the big types of contracts that most people will be aware of through system integrators and others into central government. Typically, as long as they're built correctly, or usually fall squarely within the outsourced category, and those workers will remain from a legislative perspective in the private sector and continue as they are. But there is a piece of work, and I would certainly suggest to people on the call, if they've not done that or are unaware of that beforehand, there's an urgency that you do reach out to your public sector end clients and just confirm that the arrangements and the service agreements that you're working through are indeed true outsource, and you're not potentially captured in that regard.
Very good. Jake, have we managed to get any the line open now for questions? Have we got any on online there, Dave?
I'm just checking now. Let's have a look. Don't believe so.
Hello.
Hello, Jake. Have we got you?
Yes. We have actually loads of questions coming in. Actually, I have one from
super.
I have one from Marie-Yo. She says, "Do you think that this will come into effect for the private sector? And if so, what do you think the timelines will be?"
Okay, good question. So officially, there is no steer on this. There was a lot of talk pre-budget that the expectation was that this would actually follow on very quickly into the private sector with an April 2018 start date. My previous view was absolutely it will definitely come in at some point, because the longer it doesn't, the more it actually impacts on critical public sector programs, because it allows for those critical resources to move away from the public sector. So from a government perspective, you would imagine that there's a real burning platform and drive to level that playing field to prevent that flight. However, at the moment we haven't heard anything. My gut feel is it's very disruptive. So not only clients and agencies and others who are feeling the pain of trying to work through and understand the legislation, some of the most vocal critics of it actually are the government departments themselves. So I would imagine that there will be a period of bedding in and making sure that it actually delivers what it is expected to deliver. But once that's done, I've every expectation that at some point it will, in some form, roll onto the private sector. As I mentioned in the conversation earlier on, the reality is, if it's not IR35, there will be something else targeting these types of workers in the private sector coming downstream, because it's very clear from government messaging that they see this as an area that that they want to focus on and ensure there is no disguised employment moving forward, and closing the gap as much as they can between the tax treatment of an employed worker on a payroll and someone working through this type of route, assuming that they can't prove very clearly that they're a business on their own account. So yes, I think something will come in. It may be IR35 will be the logical thing, but if it's not IR35, it will be something else targeting the same population in broadly the same way.
Cool. Thank you for the answer. We have another question from Craig Hennessy. They ask, is the employed consultant model under an umbrella body arrangement?
Perhaps I could come in on that one, Jake. No, we permanently employ them. Okay, so they're as much an employee as Dave and I are of the Experis company. So they come in, we go on our payroll, they're employed. They're an employee just like any of our 450 Experis staff in the UK. Obviously, that mitigates any risk around tax, etc., because we'll be paying their tax on their behalf, along with employers' NI, which obviously, if you, I think coming back to Dave's point a moment ago, we've just heard about the, the U-turn on NI.
I have another question along similar lines. This is from Caroline Alum. She's asked, does this affect sole traders or only limited companies?
Very good question. So technically, it's purely directed at public personal service companies in the public sector. So technically, it's a limited company only arrangement. I'm caveating that because it's a very good question. So I may well just take that offline and reconfirm 100% and come back to this group as part of the follow-up documentation. Make sure I'm 100% right on that. But my opinion is it's a limited company only target, but it's a good question, so I will clarify that for the group.
Cool. Thank you. And Mary Wilson, Caroline's replied and said thank you, that would be very helpful. Mary Wilson has asked the following question. So she says, we have an agency worker who has agreed to join us on an enhanced hourly rate with no entitlement to pension, paid annual leave and occupational sick pay. They will be an NI payer, but will they be entitled to SMP?
Good question. Again, thinking that through, I'll have to try and. Can you read it again slowly? The arrangement.
Sure. So she says, we have an agency worker and they've agreed to join us on an enhanced hourly rate with no entitlement to pension, paid annual leave and occupational sick pay. They will be a national insurance payer, but will they be entitled to SMP?
So my immediate question would be, and it's probably, again, to take offline, is what they mean by agency work and actually the vehicle they're using. Because if they're coming in as a PSC, in theory, all of those things mentioned are the responsibility of the PSC. So there shouldn't be, if you're taking an agency worker who's a PSC, none of those aspects are things that you would need to worry about as the client in those. They all still sit with the PSC to make those decisions. However, the reason I'm curious is the reference there about being a national insurance payer. Because obviously all these companies are national insurance payers. The workers still apply national insurance within the PSC. So it would be interesting to get a bit more detail about the channel that you're talking about. If it's PSC, my view would be that none of those things would apply. You pay the pay rate as you do today, or the charge rate from the agency if there's an agency involved, and that's the only stipulation. All other aspects of how those various pension, insurance, and other things and other elements are attributed sit with the PSC.
Cool, thank you. I've got another question. This is from Giles Simmons. Simply put, what is your view on the benefits of contracting moving forwards? do you see a general move away from PSCs?
Yeah, interesting question, because anybody involved in the sector will have seen probably over the last few years quite a almost herd-like swaying between various vehicles as the government attempts to alter the environment. So, for example, we had changes to travel and subsistence expenses, for example, which had an impact on umbrellas, which drove a number of people away from umbrellas into PSCs. This is very squarely targeted at PSCs, and in theory, umbrella is a route that will allow companies to still employ these types of workers and have them compliant. So I would see actually some of that being driven back. I think what you'll end up with, go back to my point about blend really, I think what it will mean is you may well see a reduction in the number of PSCs that are used, but I think the quality or the true nature of those PSCs will increase, i.e. we'll be going to specialists who work on their own account, and some of the greyer elements of that group will probably shift into umbrellas. And I think key thing from our perspective where we will see a drive we think is in the employee consultant route, because what it does give you is the flexibility from your perspective as a hirer for the worker. So they really are in essence the same from a utilisation perspective as a contractor, but the mindset of the individual, obviously they're permanently employed, so you get all those benefits that Duke mentioned about training and the belief in career development and talent development that comes with being a secure worker in a permanent job. And through companies like us, we see the benefit because obviously with a wide dispersed client base, we have the ability to move those individuals into challenging, interesting roles across a number of clients. So we think that will grow, certainly. And I think probably numerically PSC will decrease. It will still be a large part. There's an awful lot of PSCs in the UK today, and that will remain a large number, probably not as much, and you'll probably see an increase, I would imagine, initially certainly in umbrella usage as workers look to switch. If the transition doesn't happen into the private sector, you might actually end up with a bit of an interesting hybrid model as well, where individuals retain PSCs for use within the private sector opportunities, and maybe they look to take up umbrella or other PAYE-based vehicles when they're operating in the public sector. And obviously, if they are true contractors, they can do those fairly concurrently or very quickly, one after the other. But yeah, PSC. Let's make the clear statement here. This isn't the end of the PSC. PSC is a vital part of the flexibility and honestly the growth and the strength of the UK tech sector. And I don't see that changing in the short term. I think there'll be short-term disruption as people work out the best vehicle for the role, but PSC is very, very much part of the future in tech contracting, certainly.
Well, thank you. Mary Wilson, who asked the previous question regarding the employee who joined on the enhanced hourly rate with no entitlement to pension, paid annual leave, occupational sick pay, who will be a national insurance payer, she has a message saying, I understand that they've been appointed via an agency company, for example, Hayes. Would that help you answer at all?
What I suggest, because it's probably a detailed answer, which I'm more than happy to pick up on. So if we could share the details afterwards, sure. I'll take that offline and give a fuller answer.
Cool. Well, we don't have any more questions coming in at the moment. I think that's everyone sated. So I'd just like to say thank you to both of you for doing this webinar.
Yep, great. And as I say, there were some questions. Hopefully there's more, and absolutely on either of those two aspects, at the IR35 or indeed fuller details about what you can do to assist and grow and develop your perm workforce, then absolutely fire on through to us. We're more than happy to field and get into deeper conversations where applicable.
Cool. Thank you. And for everyone that's still listening, a YouTube of this entire webinar, so you can listen to it again, will be emailed to you in due course. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.